Buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos a, pues bueno, ya los últimos platos fuertes de este Congreso de Economía Austríaca, este octavo Congreso de Economía Austríaca. Como sabéis, esta es la tercera sesión sobre filosofía y sociología del liberalismo. Ya hemos tenido el panel de ponencias y ahora nos adentramos en la mesa redonda con el Premio Juan de Mariana a una trayectoria en defensa de la libertad de este año, Robert Higgs, un autor con muchas ideas innovadoras, con muchas ideas estimulantes, que de la mano de Gabriel Calzada, nuestro presidente, el presidente del Instituto Juan de Mariana, pues intentaremos que se vayan desgranando y que quienes no hayáis tenido ocasión de leerlo o de estudiarlo en profundidad, pues al menos que os pique la curiosidad con muchas de las perlas que ahora mismo pues sigan apareciendo y que tengáis ya pues un cierto incentivo y un cierto acicate a que os lancéis a leer a Robert Higgs. Y posteriormente, una vez terminemos con este panel, que durará más o menos una hora y que después de que Gabriel pues introduzca ciertos temas, abriremos el espacio al público para que también podáis plantearle las cuestiones que queráis a Robert Higgs, pues el profesor Miguel Ángel Bastos nos ofrecerá una ponencia verdaderamente magistral, como aquellas que nos tiene acostumbrados, y con eso cerraremos el octavo Congreso de Economía Austríaca. Como yo me voy a tener que ir un poquito antes de terminar, aprovecho también para recordar que mañana tenemos libre acción en el Círculo de Bellas Artes a las 10 de la mañana. Es 9:30, perdón. Bueno, lo miráis en la página web del instituto, que además es una página web que acabamos de renovar, es preciosa y por tanto es perfectamente accesible a todo el mundo. Ahí veréis si es 9:30 o 10, imagino que sea 9:30 porque vamos muy apurados de tiempo. Bueno, pues si es a las 9:30, mañana a las 9:30 en el Círculo de Bellas Artes. Si no os habéis pasado nunca, os recomiendo encarecidamente que os paséis porque veréis que es una actividad preciosa donde van desfilando diversos autores con sus obras, con sus libros, donde les podéis interpelar, les podéis preguntar, podéis interactuar con ellos, podéis incluso pedirle que os firmen el libro y comprarlo si os esforzáis mucho. Y bueno, yo creo que vale verdaderamente la pena y si ya habéis ido en alguna ocasión sabréis perfectamente lo bonita que es la actividad. Y ya luego, pues por la tarde-noche, si ya no habéis reservado, mala suerte, sed más rápidos el año que viene, porque tenemos la Cena de la Libertad, donde vamos a homenajear precisamente a Robert Higgs. Y sin más dilaciones, pues ya os dejo con la mesa redonda de don Robert Higgs y con Gabriel Calzada.
Muchas gracias, Rayo. Muchísimas gracias, Rayo. Voy a pasar a inglés para tener esta conversación con Robert Higgs. Bob, welcome.
Gracias. Muy bien.
So I will talk English and you will speak Spanish, right?
Bueno.
Okay, let's try. So Bob, you have a lot of fans here in Spain.
Muchos.
A lot of fans, and probably right now you have more fans than ever since the last election, I think. There are a lot of people probably that still don't know that they're your fans. They will be your fans in the coming months. Bob, you have wrote extensively about the economics of interventions, the dynamic of the bureaucracy, the dynamic of the state. If you would have to summarize the conclusion of several decades working on the dynamic of interventionism, what would you say is what you have learned?
That is a simple question that I cannot answer in a simple way. I've learned many things about the state since I became an economist, which was a very long time ago. I completed my PhD work in 1968, and my education was completely orthodox in neoclassical economics. I attended Johns Hopkins University, which was and still is an excellent university in the United States, but I never even heard of Austrianism. I was never asked to read anything by Mises or Hayek or Menger, and so when I started my work as an economist, I was very conventional in my own thinking about the world and how to understand it. I immediately began to learn things for myself that my teachers had never taught me. And among the things I began to learn were how the state operates, what the nature of the state is, why the state changes its actions from time to time. And it's in regard to those kinds of questions that I've worked more and more over the years. In the beginning, I worked on a variety of subjects in my research, but I didn't work in much that would qualify as political economy. And it took 10 years or more before I decided that I might be able to do something worthwhile in those areas. When I was a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, I had a colleague named Douglas North. You may have heard of him. He was awarded the Nobel Prize jointly with Robert Fogel in 1994. But I was North's colleague for 15 years, and we worked not together in any writing or research, but we worked together very closely, nevertheless, in training the students and in carrying on the economic history research program at the University of Washington. North was regarded as the leading authority among American economic historians in the relationship between the government and the state. And so I was aware of all that he was writing, and I read everything he subsequently published long before it was published, and helped to criticize it and comment on it and talk to him about it. And this was when I first began to think that I might know something that the experts such as North didn't know. And it took me a long time before I began to write seriously about it. So my book, Crisis and Leviathan, which was my first serious writing in this area, was not published until 19 years after I received my PhD. And at the time, I thought Crisis and Leviathan would be the first of a series of books, each one much better than the first one or the second one or the third one. It didn't quite work out that way for a variety of reasons, and so most people who know anything about my work know about Crisis and Leviathan, and much less, if anything, about what I wrote later. I did do a lot of writing later, but rather different, and I left academia in 1994, and that changed the kind of work I was doing and how I spent my time. So I've had a strange career in a way, but to answer the question more directly, what have I learned about the dynamics of the state? I first learned that the state is nothing like the state imagined by neoclassical economists. That is, neoclassical economists assume when they talk about policy that the state is a totally disinterested, unembodied entity which stands ready to take the advice of neoclassical economists about how to maximize social welfare. This is a terrible fantasy. This has nothing to do, nothing whatsoever to do with what a real state is or how a real state makes decisions. Real states come about in the beginning as a result of conquest, violence by robbers, and conquerors seeking tribute from conquered people. And although they evolve over time as rulers learn how to reduce the transaction costs of their domination and how to bring ideology into bear in support of their plunder, the nature of the state remains essentially the same as in the beginning, which is the state exists to facilitate plunder by those who control it. So this one idea that I eventually had about the nature of the state led me to view it very differently and to ask different kinds of questions. And also, of course, it led me to stop thinking that I should ever give advice to the state. It doesn't want my advice. It doesn't value my advice and will never act on my advice. Primarily because my first piece of advice would be to ask the state to disband and ask the rulers to get honest jobs. But nevertheless, even once I conceptualized the state in that way, there were many questions to answer, particularly about real existing states and how they've operated historically and why they've evolved in certain directions as they have. So my later work involved a variety of topics, some of which gained a following. I think my work on the Great Depression in the United States led me to elaborate, I won't say create because I didn't create this idea, I called regime uncertainty. And I wrote an article titled Regime Uncertainty, published in 1997 in the Independent Review, a journal that I edited for 17 years. And I talked about regime uncertainty as a way of helping me to understand why the Great Depression in the United States lasted so long. And I argued that it lasted not just until World War II, but it did not end until World War II ended. So the year 1946 was the end of the Great Depression in the United States. Now during the war, the Depression changed its form because the actions of the state changed their forms in order to bring overwhelming resources to bear in prosecuting the war. But nevertheless, that was not real prosperity. It gave the impression to many people that it was real prosperity because there was no unemployment. But if you have 10% unemployment and force 20% of the labor force into the military, you've solved the unemployment problem. And that's what happened in the United States during the war. So even though many people, including most economists, believe World War II ended the Depression, it did not. It changed its form. But when the war ended, the real end of the Depression occurred, and it occurred because the regime uncertainty that had arisen around 1935 as a result of actions by the Roosevelt administration also nearly disappeared when the war ended. Roosevelt was dead. His most ardent followers had been moved out of positions of influence in the presidency. And Harry Truman, who became president after Roosevelt's death, was a very pale shadow of Roosevelt as a New Dealer. So he was not the threat to investors and business people that Roosevelt and his closest lieutenants had been between 1935 and 1940. But this idea of the threat government posed to private property rights, to actual control of property, to decision making by private owners, to the receipt of income by private owners generating income, all of these ideas I think are necessary if we're going to understand the duration of the Great Depression, which was longer in the United States than in any other country. So the idea of regime uncertainty was intended to help understand that specific experience, but it has much more general application because many governments create something like regime uncertainty. I would guess, although I'm no expert on Spanish politics, that Spain is now facing some regime uncertainty of its own after the recent elections. People are not sure what actions the new governments will take, what effect it will have on private property rights, what new regulations will be put in place, how taxes will be changed. All of these things are critical to entrepreneurs. And if there's uncertainty about them, entrepreneurs tend to react to heightened uncertainty by becoming almost paralyzed, by keeping their assets in a very liquid form, sometimes by even removing them from the country where this uncertainty exists, and certainly by not making major new long-term investments, because the long-term horizon is so difficult to predict with confidence that one would be a fool to hazard large amounts of one's wealth on the prospect that everything will turn out well enough for profits to be realized. So I think the idea of regime uncertainty was one that is a good idea and applicable more widely than simply in understanding the duration of the Great Depression in the United States.
Oh, I will take the microphone because I see that you will answer all my questions here before I pass to the second one. You mentioned Crisis and Leviathan. You mentioned Crisis and Leviathan, and I remember, I think it was in late 1986 or early 1987 that Rothbard wrote for the Volcker Fund a review, a private review on the book. I don't know if it has been published or not.
No.
The review was that long that it was almost a book in itself. I have the opportunity, as you know, to go through most of Rothbard's private writings to the Volcker Fund, and there is nothing similar to that. Most of his reviews were 10 pages long, 12 pages long, but this was what, 80 pages long?
27.
28, I think. It was an essay. It was an essay, and I don't remember seeing a review as favorable from Rothbard to anyone than the review he did on Crisis and Leviathan. How much did you pay to Rothbard?
What happened was that I was working on this book with the cooperation of the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco. And they had helped me find a little bit of support for myself while I was doing the research. But when I did produce a manuscript in 1986, the Pacific Institute organized a conference in which they got a number of excellent people, some historians, some economists, to comment on my draft. And we held that conference out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Rothbard read my manuscript for that occasion and actually wrote a paper of his own in response to the chapter in my book which deals with the progressive era, the era from about 1900 to World War I. And when the Pacific Institute asked Rothbard to review my book, it asked several other people, and they did write back. They wrote the usual things that scholars would write on that occasion, a page or two. Nothing major, but Rothbard did write 27 pages, single spaced, with hundreds of references to books and articles that I had not read. And he liked the book very much. The first 2 pages of his review were dedicated to praise. And if I'd stopped there, I would have felt very good about myself. But then he went on basically to talk about things I ought to read and different ways of looking at things. And at that point, I could do 2 things only. One, I could despair and give up my career as an economist, feeling like a failure. Or 2, I could go ahead and make what few changes I was able to make in my draft and then publish the book and hope for the best. And the amazing thing, as Gabriel indicated, was that when the book was published, Rothbard wrote a review for Liberty magazine, which breathed not a single word of criticism, which was full of embarrassing praise. But he and I knew the truth. So even though I never told Murray the story about how I imagined this would be the first of 7 or 8 books, each one better than the preceding one, he would have liked that story. Murray Rothbard and I became great friends from the mid-'80s until his death in the mid-'90s. And so it's one of the highlights of my life that I got to know him so well. He was a fascinating individual and extraordinarily knowledgeable in a wide field, a number of different fields, and fun. Rothbard, some people may not understand, was just a lively man with a great sense of humor. He loved to sing songs, and sometimes at conferences we would just get together in the evenings and sing for hours. But at all events, this is the story of Rothbard's review of my book.
Bob, you spoke in your Crisis in Leviathan about several kinds of wars, military wars, the war on poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, and you have written about it, the government has invented several other wars.
Yes.
Very lately, the war on fast food, the war on many different things. Do you still think that the military war are probably the most dangerous one for civilization, or are other kinds of war that are more subtle that might pose a big danger to prosperity?
I think large wars are the most dangerous activity for liberty, because governments at war will go farther to destroy liberty in order to carry out their war program than governments will go to do anything else in general. And certainly in the history of the United States, the 2 world wars were by far the most important events, even more important than the Great Depression, because if you go back and look at what was done during the Great Depression that moved toward the destruction of liberty, almost everything done had been done earlier during World War I and was simply revived and done again during peacetime. So wars have been in the United States and in many other countries terribly destructive of liberty, because even though the governments normally represent their wartime actions as temporary, as taken only in order to carry out the war successfully, that's not how societies operate. There was a wonderful statement made by William Graham Sumner in the late 19th century. Sumner was a classical liberal of some importance in the United States, and he said one time, you cannot experiment with a society and just drop the experiment whenever you wish. The experiment enters into the life of the society and never can be got out again. And what he was talking about was a kind of path dependency, to use a modern term. The fact that when you move in a certain direction with a society, with a state and its relation to society, you can never go back exactly where you were before. You can't revert perfectly. And I had developed an idea connected with this in my book, the ratchet effect, I called it, in order to help explain how the government grew in the United States. And of course, this ratchet has occurred in many other places as well. But the point is that societies are made up of individuals who are learning from what happens, from what they experience, from what they're told, from the explanations they encounter. And when you change society quickly and strongly, as you do during a major war or a major upheaval such as the Great Depression, you compel people to live differently, to think differently. You move them in directions where their minds will never be able to go back to where their minds were before. And it's this kind of dynamic that gets built in that creates long-term movements that no one may have planned. Although it is true that many people close to power understand the ratchet effect, and so they will even plainly say sometimes that an emergency is a good thing. You want to take advantage of an emergency because you can more easily carry out your program than you could before.
I think we met for the first time in 1999, and then a couple of years later, 11th of September took place, and you became one of the, how can I say, one of the most polemic economists in the country, in the U.S. What was your position, and what was the relationship with other economists that had a very different view?
Gabriel is referring to how I responded to the events that followed the attacks of September 11, 2001 on the World Trade Towers in New York and on the Pentagon building in Washington. I could see immediately that the government was going to use these events as a pretext for taking a variety of actions that it wouldn't likely have taken before. One of the most important ones was the attack on Iraq. The persons identified as the terrorists of 9/11 were not Iraqis. Not one was an Iraqi. And yet there were powerful people in or close to the government of George W. Bush who had wanted the U.S. government to attack and change the government of Iraq for a very long time, for decades. And they had actually written about this and taken a variety of political actions to persuade the government to act aggressively toward Iraq. This was their time when they could carry out those attacks. And so I began to write in opposition to what they were doing, even before the attack on Iraq in early 2003. But I wrote a number of articles for newspapers and magazines in 2002, warning people if the government proceeds with what it's trying to persuade you to support, you will live to regret it. And I actually believe that many people have lived to regret it, and even some of the people who acted most vigorously to bring about those attacks in 2003 came to regret their actions later, although Many of them did not at all. So, but my position was that this action by the United States to widen the war and to plunge recklessly into the Middle East would be not just a disaster for the Middle East, which it most certainly has been, but it would be a disaster for liberty in the United States. My studies of war in the past had convinced me that when the state goes to war, the liberty of its own subjects is bound to suffer. And so I could see it coming. One could even see the ways in which it would come, at least in a general sense. So I was concerned to use whatever voice I had to oppose those actions, and I've opposed them vigorously ever since. Just as long ago, when I was a very young man, I opposed the war in Vietnam in a variety of ways and have continued to oppose it and speak against it all my life. I'm not a patriot in the usual sense. As Thomas Paine said, where liberty is, there is my country.
The U.S. is fighting one of the several wars the U.S. is fighting currently. It's a war where mainly Latin American countries are having the casualties, thousands of casualties, and the U.S. is not suffering much from that from that war, at least apparently. I'm talking about the war on drugs, obviously, and you're about to move to a country that is having, according to some numbers, 150,000 people have been killed because of the war on drugs in Mexico. What can we do? Can we teach them something? Can we send them your books and maybe they can learn about what happens when you start doing something like that? Or what can we do?
I think there are various things that can be done, but before anything can succeed, many more people have to understand the nature of the war on drugs, especially in the United States, because that's where all of this harm comes from. If it weren't for the prohibition of the use of certain drugs in the United States, none of these evils would have come to Mexico or Guatemala or Colombia or a number of other Latin American countries which have been devastated, especially by loss of life, by actions related to the war on drugs, actions that would not have been taken without the intimidation of the United States government on these less powerful governments elsewhere and bribery of these governments as well. So the root of this evil lies in the United States war on drugs, and it's necessary that that be stopped. There are some movements in that direction currently. Several states have legalized the possession, use, and growth of marijuana recently, and those experiments are all working out fine, just as I would have expected them to work. But it creates an anomalous situation when some states allow legal use of marijuana and the state next door makes it a criminal offense. Right now, people can go from the state of Colorado into the state of Kansas driving in their cars, and the Kansas police wait, just stopping people and arresting them on the chance that they may find someone with marijuana, which they can then send to prison in Kansas. People don't understand, if they have not studied it, that the war on drugs has been an enormous success, because it's been a great way for the governments at every level to make themselves more powerful, to get more resources at their command, to strengthen the police and then use them in any way that the political authorities find expedient. It is, in short, an excellent way for liberty to be utterly destroyed in the United States by the creation of a police state, ostensibly being used to suppress illegal trade and use of drugs. So it has been a horrible thing for civil society. We haven't had the number of people killed in the drug war in the United States that Mexico or Colombia or Guatemala or Honduras have had killed, but there's been tremendous devastation of lives, and some of you may know that the United States imprisons far greater numbers of people relative to its population than any other country in the world. Any other country. Not Russia, not China. No other country comes close to putting the number of people in prison that the United States does relative to its population. There are 3 million people now in jail or prison in the United States, and another 4 million under some kind of supervision, probation or early release, but still under supervision of the police authorities. 7 million people under police authority in a country of only 318 million people. That's horrible. And it puts every American at risk. We never know when the police will burst into our homes, day or night, with commandos, SWAT teams, we call them. And they kill people almost randomly. The lawlessness of these police is indescribable. And to be quite honest with you here, it seems odd that I would leave the United States and move to Mexico, where maybe 100,000 people have been killed in the drug war, and the short answer is I'm going to a very safe and secure place in Mexico. And the drug war doesn't affect the entire country equally. But another reason is that the United States has become such a horrible police state that I don't want to live there any longer. And I don't want, to even be there. I'm afraid of police I see. And I don't want to live like that.
I wanted to make you a question about the regime uncertainty in the recent election in Spain, but I'm so sure that our public is going to ask you a related question that I will make it the last question, and I pass the mic to the public. And it's a very easy question. I think everybody who has read your work or listened to your conference has a question. Are you an Austrian? Are you a public choice scholar? Are you a new institutionalist? Or are you just a contrarian?
I'm not just a contrarian. Schumpeter one time said, when asked why there was no Schumpeterian school, which during his lifetime there was none, and he said, fish go in schools. That was a little too offhand, I think. But I took it to heart in a way. I believe that we can learn from a variety of perspectives, and I have in my own work drawn on Austrian economics a great deal, especially as time has gone by and I've become more of an Austrian, and I'm not ashamed to call myself an Austrian economist, but I often suspect that many Austrians think me a very bad one because I'm so tolerant of and make use of non-Austrian contributions, including the neo-institutional economics, to which I've contributed a fair amount myself over the years, more so in the early part of my career, but to some extent even in recent years. I've learned from public choice, certainly, although I have my quarrels with public choice. And if I were honest, I'd have to say that I haven't forgotten everything I learned from neoclassical economics, although I have tried to forget the methodological underpinnings of neoclassical economics, because I think those are completely bankrupt. Yes, I have tried to find insights wherever I could find them in ways that did not contradict one another. I don't want to try to reconcile A and not A in my own mind, but if I can find ways of understanding the world better by drawing ideas from different fields or different schools, then I will do so.
With that, we pass the mic to the public. I don't know if there are questions, comments, jokes.
Dr. Higgs, you usually define a concept that ratchet effect. But in example, Mank Olson in another book, For and Rise of Nations, said that wars could be good in the sense that they destroy all the regulations, clean the trash, all the special interests.
Right.
War could be good if you are defeated, if you lost the war.
Well, Mansur Olson did argue in his book, I think 1980 publication, that there builds up what he called an institutional sclerosis, a clogging of the veins with government interferences over time, and interest groups become more powerful and entrenched, and they harm the efficiency of the economy and reduce its creativity dynamically. And he gave some examples. His book, I think, is very, very poor in the sense of the examples. The econometric work he did was very shoddy empirical work. I used to do applied econometrics a lot, and I know good from bad, and that was bad. But the idea does not sink or swim with how good his econometrics were. I think it is probably true that in certain kinds of cases, like the ones he mentioned in Germany and Japan after World War II, that powerful interest groups that had played a very negative role before those wars and during them were destroyed or greatly weakened. And that had a very positive effect on the post-war success of both of those countries. That seems right to me. I don't think, however, we can generalize it as Mansur Olson did. I think it's an idea that does apply in some cases, but certainly not in all. And one reason, of course, why it works so well for Germany and Japan is that those countries lost those wars. I mean, their governments had to surrender unconditionally and be occupied by enemy troops for, well, Germany's still occupied by enemy troops. And Japan as well. So you could say that was critical. In a case like the United States, which has not lost any wars in that way, it's been defeated by time and weariness in Vietnam and elsewhere, but the ratchet effect goes only one way in an institutional context like that.
Hi, Professor. I have two questions for you. One, as an economic historian, I would like to ask you about your relationship with the historian academia. It's my feeling that most of the readings I do, they seem to be still in the 70s. They speak about class, they still speak about exploitation, they still speak about, they have this admiration for the king, the emperor. The historians, normally they are not very much liberals or libertarians in any way. How is your relationship with them, and do you think that with this ideology they can really explain history quite well? And the second one is a very personal question. You seem to be, through your Facebook, a very happy person. You seem to be, you are speaking about your wife, Elizabeth, and seeing you, you are always smiling. Do you think your ideology has somehow influenced in your happiness?
The other way.
Well, first of all, with regard to the historical profession, it is in very bad shape. And it's become worse in the past 50 years. It's become so tied in its own knots of political correctness and concentrated so much on race, class, gender, ethnicity, all tied up in a quasi-Marxist web of ribbons of exploitation and white power structures and patriarchy and a lot of nonsense. So I think the historical field is not in a position to learn much from me. I do think that some of my work has got through to them, but just because good historians read everything on a subject, and because I wrote on certain subjects, they've read that. It hasn't necessarily changed their minds in any way. It's just another entry in the bibliography. I think some of the work I did in the 1970s and early 1980s on race relations in the United States had some considerable substantive effect on the historians of that subject. And I hope so, at least. I wrote, my second book was called Competition and Coercion, and the subtitle was Blacks in the American Economy, 1865 to 1914. And this was an area of research in which the historians had painted a totally dark picture. And my research showed that there had been a great deal of progress among the emancipated slaves after the war between the states. And even though they were in terrible condition 50 years later, they were much better off than they had been immediately after the war, and certainly better off than they had been as slaves. So I tried to put that problem in a different perspective, and I think I had some success, not anything like total success there. But you know, the saying is win some, lose some. You have to not bring your hopes too high when you do research that you think challenges and overturns and debunks the existing literature, because people are slow to change, and professors, you know, use the same notes for 50 years. So I'm not discouraged about that. You know, as for my personal outlook, I strive for happiness. I think it's a mistake to become completely enveloped in one's ideology, so that you know, before one does anything, before one makes a friend, before one takes an innocent action, you think back, am I violating the non-aggression principle? And you agonize over that. Life shouldn't be filled with agony. There are plenty of terrible things in the world, even in day-to-day life. But my wife likes to remind me, because she has this same kind of question in her mind. She likes to remind me that people have even been happy in the gulag. So I've got no good reason, you know, not to be happy. If Solzhenitsyn could find a ray of hope, then certainly I can.
Hi, Bob. Since you are well versed in economics and neoclassical economics, new institutional economics, I want to ask you if we Austrians, or what core ideas do you think are the ones which we can learn from neoclassical economics and new institutional economics, since you have this well-trained formation?
Well, I think especially from see, the good things that still exist in neoclassical economics are not so different from the way Austrians see things, like understanding the role of relative prices, relative costs, incentives and constraints. That's all part of Austrian economics as much as it is a part of good neoclassical economics. And all of the PhD students I trained are excellent at doing that kind of analysis. None of them isn't Austrian, but they're very good economists nonetheless, because they can do the kinds of things that you learn to do from reading the textbook by Alchian and Allen, which I still recommend. It's neoclassical economics, but it teaches you how to understand the world much better than you otherwise would. So in that sense, I think we can all learn neoclassical economics, and I don't think Mises ever intended to overturn that part of neoclassical economics himself, or Hayek for that matter. And sometimes their own analysis is just this kind of applied relative price theory. I think that the new institutional economics can teach us a lot, particularly that when we study concrete, real events in the world, it's essential, of course, that we understand the logic of action, which we learned from Austrian economics. But it's also essential that we learn the actual empirical context in which we're providing an explanation. It's the distinction between being good economists in the Misesian sense, having praxeology down, and being good economic historians in the Misesian sense. That's where we have to understand a lot about the people whose actions we're trying to explain. What are their beliefs? How did they get these beliefs? What do they want? How are they trying to get what they want? And so forth. And that's the kind of contextualization that the new institutional economics has tried to provide. A little more formally, the main problem I have with the new institutional economics is that it's still a branch of neoclassical economics, and I don't think it has to be. And I have some friends, particularly at George Mason University, who've taken a broader view and teach their students a lot from the new institutional economics, and as I did when I was teaching PhD students and training them, and then they went out and did more of that same kind of work very well. I'm very proud, by the way, of my PhD students. I had some at Washington, and I had a couple at Francisco Marroquin. And these are all wonderful economists, not one Austrian in the group, but very good people.
Okay, as we are running out of time, I will beg you to comprise the two last questions, okay? And so we'll make both questions at the same time, and then you answer.
Did you meet Mises or Hayek personally?
I met Hayek and got to know him actually in the late 1970s. He came to visit the University of Washington when I was on the faculty there to give some lectures in Seattle, and I think I was the only member of the faculty from 36 members who was interested in Hayek. So I was appointed to be his local guide and driver, and I spent a lot of time with him for several days, and this was an honor for me. So it was great. I did get to know him. I did not have the opportunity to meet Mises.
Talking about new institutional economics, they have been criticized because some of the conclusions that are all or most of the institutions that exist are like the most efficient ones. What do you think Austrian economics or other school of economics can do or can propose to solve this problem?
You're saying the criticism of neo-institutionalism is that they've emphasized efficiency too much or too little?
Too much.
Too much.
At least that's one criticism I have read.
I think that where they go wrong there is in the way they even think about efficiency. They think about it too much like neoclassical economists think about it. And there's not enough subjectivism. That's where an Austrian view would be very helpful to them. That would cure them from drawing conclusions about efficiency, perhaps at all, because there's a sense in which an Austrian may say that everything that's done is efficient, given the actual beliefs and constraints of the actors. You know, why would anyone take an action that he knew or believed to be adverse to his interests? And if there were an opportunity to gain, why would anybody not take advantage of that opportunity? So many neoclassicals object to that view because they think this is like Dr. Pangloss, you know, we live in the best of all possible worlds all the time. I think that one simply doesn't want to place that interpretation on it. We don't live in the best of all possible worlds, but the worlds that are superior must be discovered. They must be seen by entrepreneurs and acted upon in the belief that a gain exists there. And if we think, as Austrians do, of every person as an entrepreneur of some kind, then we're in a much better position to understand actions that look inefficient to neoclassical economists, including the new institutional people.
So with that, Bob, thank you very much. And hopefully tomorrow you will continue talking about your work and your ideas with Carlos Rodriguez Brown at the book fair,
Yes.
Liberación. Thanks.
Thank you.